Thanks everyone for coming and giving your attention. Thanks to the London Dev Group for allowing me to speak when London's Calling rejected this talk. Thanks to Monica, if she's still here, for doing all the organisation that allowed Nebula to host this. I said yes, and then Monica do all the work. So we're going to talk about DevOps on Salesforce and deployments on Salesforce. And I've had a drink, so it might be even more feisty than at other times. Very quick intro to me. As Tom mentioned, technology director at Nebula. Did a PhD in computer science a long time ago, 10 years on Salesforce. What is more interesting than that is that a lot of the stuff that I've seen before about DevOps and Salesforce has not really been from the perspective of a consultancy working in Salesforce. It tends to be an end user who's decided to adopt it wholesale, or an ISV that controls everything that they build. And for a consultancy, we have some different challenges that we're going into a different customer every time. So we have to figure out what the right approach is for that customer. So we have to really think about the motivations of what we're doing with DevOps, and then be able to articulate that to customers. And sometimes the idea that we can get the whole company to buy into what we'd like them to do just doesn't pan out. You know, if we're talking to a multinational company and we're just little old Nebula, we may not be able to change how everything works there. We have to find a way that works for the part that we're doing, and then sort of draw them towards doing things more like the way we would like. So, if we were to describe Salesforce DevOps in one picture. I mean, if anyone has tried to deploy during a release window or worked a lot with CPQ or communities or some of these other things, they will have felt the pain of the bin fire. I would at least point out the bin fire smiling, that, you know, Salesforce is a nice place to be. It used to be horrendous before Salesforce DX and all of that. But nonetheless, it's pretty hard. So let's dive into what we're going to talk about then. One other thing I mentioned is, obviously it says DevOps streaming and sponsored by Gearset. I didn't update my templates, I'm sorry. But I did change a few slides, so there we go. So we talk about the approach, the balance between simplicity and getting overcomplicated. We talk about different kinds of learning environments and how that affects the challenges of working with DevOps. I'm going to argue that the only truth is production. People who talk about DevOps and Salesforce love to say that source control is the source of truth. I wish it were. I don't think it is. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about cargo culting behaviors from other places. If you're familiar with the term cargo culting, then I've got pictures which you may not have seen before. If you're not, then I'm going to explain what it is and show you how that's relevant to this. Then, having moaned a lot, I'm going to talk about some actual positive things of approaches and things that we can take away from this. So first off, simplicity and the illusion of simplicity. When I think about deploying on Salesforce, if I was to sum up in a sentence what I want to move my code from A to B without drowning in a pool of my own tears. That's basically what. And it seems simple. And the second word in that statement, if you're a consultancy, just, may be quite a sort of triggering word for you. Customers will often say, oh, can you just do this? Can you just do that? And in their head, it's really simple. And we're going to see later on that there are real reasons why deploying on Salesforce is actually quite hard and quite complicated. But first, a fun example of this kind of simplicity problem. Say we have a book and we just want to localize it from US English to British English. That's fine. That's the kind of thing a customer would say. I would just do a search and replace. Every time it says pants, we'll say trousers. We've now made the word partista trousers. And if you think I'm making this up, there's a book with partista trousers. So some of the things that we think should be simple are actually harder because the real world's a bit more complicated than our naive view of it would like it to be. On the other hand, we love complicated things as developers. We like our little intricate mechanisms. And for watchmakers, any feature of a timepiece that's not to do with telling the time, they call a complication. And if as developers we talked about, instead of talking about features, we talked about complications, we might not add so many of them. And there's this tension between this really complicated thing. Oh, it's beautiful, it's lovely, I made this. But then you could probably do the same job with one of those. And if anyone's got like the running watchers like me, if someone asks you what time it is on a run and you're there going through like 10 menus to tell them what time it is, and they're laughing at you for how ridiculous you are, when that would do the same job. And I think what we're trying to do with DevOps, with anything really within software, but particularly for this within DevOps, is kind of sail between those things of making it too complicated or making it too simple, and try and justify every piece of complication we put into whatever process we're going to do. So learning environments. This is, I think, one of the other things that makes DevOps challenging. And there's some terminology around learning environments that I picked up from a book called Range by David Epstein, which I would enormously recommend. It's about the different outcomes that you get between people who specialize in something and people who are more generalist for longer before they specialize. And it's a really fascinating book. But the learning environments part of that is that he talks about different kinds of environments that you can be in when you're working on something. So a kind learning environment is one where you take an action and then the feedback that you get is unambiguous and timely, and you immediately know whether or not things have worked. And in that sort of environment, it's quite easy to make progress. You just try something, you see if it worked, and then if it didn't work, you can change your approach and try again. But then there are wicked learning environments, in his terminology, where you take an action and the feedback, it might be delayed, it might be unclear, it might just not have any feedback at all. And it's quite hard to progress in these environments unless we take a kind of scientific approach to what we're doing and try to really set out with how are we going to measure the results of what we're trying to do here. And I think DevOps falls much more into that wicked learning environment. If we make some changes to the way we deploy stuff, how does that actually affect the company's performance? And if that performance has improved, has that changed because we're doing different kind of projects or because our teams have changed at the same time? There's so many different things that could happen, and it makes it quite hard. So to put some examples on these sorts of learning environments, the classic examples of kind learning environments are things like sports and games. Or for a developer, a linter or a compiler, as soon as you write something that the compiler doesn't like, you can get immediate feedback, red underline, you get warnings and things. And the example I think of in sports is in kayaking. If you're learning to roll a kayak, there's a particular movement you need to switch the paddle. And very unambiguously, if you're still upside down, it's not worked. You know it's not worked. Whereas other things like parenting, you have your kids, you try and do some things with them, quite how they turn out, whether that was down to you, I just don't know. And the time to evaluate that is very long. And medicine suffers from this as well. There's all sorts of long-term conditions. It's very hard to figure out whether or not the actions that the doctors have taken have actually affected the outcomes. And as I say, I think DevOps is very much in that category. So rather than just applying a ton of DevOps to everything, let's be a bit more careful about what we apply and try and measure the results in some way if we can. So I will get to it eventually. Not all complexity is accidental. Another term that I like of stuff. So there's two different types of complexity that some people talk about, which is accidental complexity and fundamental complexity. If I'm trying to solve a problem, that problem may have fundamental complexity in how hard that problem is. Whereas the accidental complexities are the things that we introduce by the way we try to solve the problem. So if we choose a particular programming language, that might make it harder to solve the problem and add a load of accidental complexity. Whereas the problem itself just has this hardness to it. And some of the complexity around doing DevOps and Salesforce is not necessarily about how we've decided to do it. It's fundamental to the platform and the way it works. So Salesforce sells itself on being easy to configure. And making changes in production, for a lot of the people who have been buying Salesforce historically as a feature and not a bug, they can change things without having to log a ticket with IT, and they love that. And if you're going to go along and tell them that they're not allowed to do that anymore, you are going to have an uphill battle. And that's just part of the system. They prioritize new features over making them deployable, for sure. You see stuff come out, it looks brilliant, then you realize it's beta, so you wait a bit longer, and then you realize you can't deploy it anyway. And it's completely understandable for Salesforce to take this approach. It means they can innovate really quickly without having to run everything past the team that do metadata and deployments. But it really does make our lives harder. And if we accept that, and we accept that these things are difficult, then we can sort of live with the fact that things are more complicated. Often the metadata that we want to deploy ends up being stored as data. There's all kinds of packages. We all know CPQ does this. We know lots of historic managed packages do this. So whatever you build to deploy metadata, you also have to build a pipe that deploys data to make that work. That's an extra challenge for us. There are some updates that we may want to make in a system which are not atomic. They require multiple deployments to achieve. I mean, even something relatively simple like changing the type of a field if it's referenced in code takes a whole series of deployments. And if you're working with multi-cloud environments, then there's a whole load of deployments. Maybe you're working with clouds which don't even do deployments. So you're literally working with two windows and typing from one to the other. And coordinating all of that is hard. Communities. And some of the metadata objects are just massively overloaded with responsibilities. If there are classes, we call them God classes, that they profiles and page layouts. Every team has a reason to change these things. So as soon as you get into working with multiple teams and trying to merge stuff in your DevOps process, they're going to be treading on each other's toes all the time. And the last one is the one I mentioned before about consultancies may struggle to get buy-in from everyone. Really, the kind of DevOps approach works best if you can get everyone to buy into it and work on it through the whole process, but that might not always be possible. You don't have to give up. You could do what you could do within that environment. And completely unnecessary picture of my cat looking grumpy, but data is often a big factor. You know, we talk about DevOps as if we're just deploying pieces of logic, but a lot of the time we need to update the data to respect that logic that we're adding, and that is really hard, and that is really hard to roll back. And if you don't think about it until the last minute, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. So let's talk about the source of truth. We all know the configuration in the system is code as well, and it should be in source control as well, and it should be managed properly. But there is a lot of metadata in Salesforce. Does anyone want to take a punt at how many pieces of metadata there are in the code coverage report? What number that would be of different types of metadata there are?
581.
Oh, that would be right a few months ago. 581 was a bid from over there. 601 today. I've done this talk a few times, and every time I do it, I go back there, and that number's gone up. What has not gone up is the number of things that people put in version control. So, for example, GearSet's default CI filter is 8, which is 1% of that complete set of metadata. We use about 24. It's about 4%. So 96 is still dark matter as far as that's concerned. And okay, maybe that stuff doesn't matter, but probably it does. And maybe we can't deploy it. But the idea that source control is the source of truth, and we could build an org by just taking everything that's in source control and putting it in an empty org, it's just not going to happen. People at Nebula will know that I like wild tangents for showing off that I read stuff. So, Plato's Cave. If you're not familiar with Plato's Cave, I can talk you through it from left to right. So, on the left of Plato's Cave, we have some people who are living in the cave. They were born in the cave, they've lived their whole lives in the cave, and as far as they're concerned, the real world is everything that they're seeing is the shadows on the wall of the cave. But obviously those shadows are not the real world. The shadows are created by the people behind the wall carrying these figures across there, and the real world is above the ground. You can see these people escaping up to the real world on the right-hand side. And if the people who'd seen the real world came down and tried to tell the people in the cave that there was actually a three-dimensional world out there with sunlight, they just wouldn't believe it because their entire experience the whole time has been nothing but these shadows. And Plato's point here was that people who get no further than the immediate feedback from their senses and don't use philosophy to actually query what they're seeing are, in his term, plebs, who are like the people in the cave. And if you wonder why I'm going on about this, I can change one of those shadows, and you'll start to get an idea. The shadows on the cave, if you think source control is the source of truth, are your source control. And really, the CI system is just bringing these objects across when us poor devs are just crying in the corner, looking at the shadows, when the real world is above there. And the idea that source control could be our source of truth is kind of a useful abstraction, but also it's a leaky abstraction. If you go to try and solve a problem that you've seen in the real system, and you fully trust that source control is going to tell you everything you need to know about solving that problem, you will get caught out repeatedly because there will be things that are not in source control for you. So can we say source control is a source of truth? Not really. It's only got a fraction of the metadata. It can miss changes made directly in production, and people have legitimate reasons for making changes directly in production. Even if we have a CI system and the only way to get into production is to go via source control, deployments could still fail. There could be something that has been merged into the main branch and has not been successfully deployed. That can absolutely happen. So although source control is truth is a useful abstraction, and we can look at the source control and it's really useful, we need to remember that it's not the absolute truth. So cargo cults, subtitle. You ain't Google. Is anyone from Google? You ain't Google. And to explain that, what cargo cults are about is taking the practices from successful companies and just copying them into your company as if that will make you successful without necessarily understanding why those companies did that and whether or not that fits for your context. So the processes that these companies have are meaningless unless you understand the intentions and the context around them. Does anyone recognize that quote? Room full of devs. Someone must. Yes, from the Agile Manifesto. And the Agile Manifesto says we should prioritize individuals and interactions over processes and tools. And if you buy yourself a chunk of DevOps and you just copy Google, then you're prioritizing processes over people, and you're getting it wrong. One of the things about DevOps and processes that we have for that is that we should choose the thing that fits us. We shouldn't necessarily feel like there's this mountain that we should climb where we're going to reach DevOps nirvana at some point, and we're not there until we reach that very summit. There's a level that's right for a company, for a project, and it's important to try and figure out what that level is rather than just assume that we need to go all the way up. So, where did this whole cargo cult term come from? World War II in Melanesia. Where's Melanesia? There. So it's a group of islands, Fiji to New Guinea, and during World War II, the Americans were basing Air Force people out there. And these American Air Force, they were bringing all kinds of things that the local islanders had never seen. They were bringing foods they'd never seen. They were bringing the planes themselves and electricity and all this stuff. And while the Americans were there, they were sharing it with the islanders. Eventually, the war ended, and the Americans left. And the islanders had never really understood how these wonderful things that the Americans had were coming to them. They'd just seen that these things were happening, and then these were the outputs. So after the Americans left, the islanders started copying the symbols that they'd seen. And they literally built straw planes and their own runways in the hope that that would bring some of the stuff that they had when the Americans were there. And I'm not telling you all this to laugh at the islanders. This is exactly what we do as well. It's a very kind of human thing. When you see something that you don't understand, you just try copying that, and then maybe I'll be able to take the step to understand it. But if you don't take the step to understand it, then you're just pointlessly copying stuff. What's funny about this is it's got some really cool pictures. And this picture I've taken from a presentation about Agile, where they were talking about cargo culting Agile practices, which is quite related to all of this. But the hilarious thing is, if you look in the background of this picture, it doesn't really look like Melanesia. It's a bit of a kind of English-looking house, a kind of English-looking fence. And that's actually, there's an ice cream company in Cheshire that does a marketing promotion every year where they build sculptures out of haystacks. And the guy giving the Agile talk had just copied this from somewhere else without finding out where it had come from. He was talking about pointlessly copying stuff. Classic. So the relation to DevOps really is about, if we look at something like the DORA metrics and the State of DevOps report, we need to give that a very careful reading. Ideally, go and read the book Accelerate, which explains why they came up with all these metrics and how they think all of that stuff works. And if we just pick one of these kind of metrics from the DORA set and focus exclusively on that, we're going to get things wrong. So if you want to be elite, you need to deploy multiple times a day. But what does that actually mean? If we're deploying to production multiple times a day, are users actually getting new functionality multiple times a day? Does a busy salesperson actually want their software changing under their feet multiple times a day? Probably not. Do they need training on that stuff? Quite possibly. So maybe that deployment is code reaching production, but no one actually using it. It's all hidden behind a feature flag. And if that's what you're doing, then you might be missing one of the things that you wanted to achieve here. If you wanted to make smaller deployments because they're safer, and you make a load of smaller deployments, then you hide it behind a feature flag, and then you flick that feature flag and your last 100 deployments suddenly become live. That's not meaningfully different than just doing one big deployment at the time when you switched on the feature flag. So if we just focus on the metrics and we don't think about why we're actually doing these things, we can lead ourselves down the wrong path. You could deploy twice a day through 2 deployment windows, for example. And if you're working with a global company, it could well be that those 2 deployment windows are while they're asleep. And that doesn't make any sense either. And so you've got to even read this thing very carefully. It says on demand, not just multiple times per day. On demand is the important part there. And more generally, some of you may have seen this before, the idea that whenever a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So if you're targeting deploying multiple times per day rather than measuring your deployment and DevOps ability and just sort of observing that that's there, then it doesn't become useful anymore. More fun things I like to bang on about. That's called Goodhart's Law, named after a man. It was actually coined by a woman called Marilyn Strathern. Proper reference. So that was all depressing. Everything's terrible. What can we actually do? How can we deploy stuff on Salesforce without crying so much? So I've got 3 different possibilities to explain to you. One is unlock packaging, which I'm a big advocate of. And if you haven't come across it before, the idea is that you could split your Salesforce org up into packages, which are a bit like managed packages, but they're a bit looser in their definition. Once you've released something, you can actually take it out again in an unlocked package. And so you might have a system like this, where you have different packages for different parts and concepts within the system. And within this, we've got the SendGrid package here is just about sending emails by SendGrid, and it doesn't necessarily need to know anything about the rest of the system. All of its objects are within itself, and if you want to send something, you effectively call an API in that package, and it doesn't work. Great. You could have another kind of packages to do with archiving, and that needs to know everything about your system, because it's going to archive all the custom objects you've defined. So for that, you've got org-dependent packaging, where you're building a package that knows everything that's already in your org. And then you've got the more kind of conventional version of this unlocked packaging, where we've got a bunch of interdependent packages that build up parts of the functionality within the system. So if you're using unlocked packaging, you can use these different types of packages to achieve your end goals. You don't have to just pick one and only use that. So we can look at some of the pluses and minuses of unlocked packaging. It gives you a really clean separation of functional areas. If somebody wants to work on SendGrid or archiving, they just check out the relevant repo and they know they're in the right place. It really is source-driven. The package is built from just what you have in the repository. And okay, that won't tell you everything about how it will behave in production, but that package itself is source-driven, which is great. You could do it with all Salesforce tooling. You don't need to buy anything else. Just works. The org-dependent packaging, which came slightly later after people had talked a lot about packaging, means that you don't have to split your entire org up into a network of dependent packages. You can actually work with what you have and move towards something else, which is really great. And it does make parallel work easy. If you're working on separate packages, 2 people can just do that, and they're not going to interfere with each other, which is good. Downsides, not everything is packageable. That list of metadata things in the metadata coverage report, the packaging one is the smallest set of support. I mean, it covers most things, but there are omissions. We found that it doesn't work all that well if your packages are based around stuff on the standard cloud. So if you're doing things around sales processes and service processes, that runs into the kind of thing that packaging doesn't do well. I've left the next point there about migrating from a messy code base, but I don't believe in it anymore. So one of the things that people objected to about packaging was that if you were going to break your spaghetti org up into separate functional areas, then that's quite a hard piece of dev work to do. But I would actually argue if you want to do DevOps properly, you're probably going to have to do that anyway. Because if all your code is great big spaghetti code, every time you have teams working in parallel, they're all going to be touching the same files. And so you're going to have to grasp that nettle of teasing things apart anyway, whichever approach you take. Can be hard to manage dependencies. It really is. It sucks. Dependency injection and other kind of fancy code techniques are things that some people shy away from. Again, I think that's kind of related to the point of you probably ought to tidy up your code base and do these things anyway. And the time to configure a scratch org is quite long. It is. There are tools to deal with that if you're into it. So back to the idea of production is truth before we get into the next technique. Let's say production is truth. Let's work with that. Bilbo is going to create it in prod. Why shouldn't he? He's bought Salesforce. What can we actually do with our DevOps process to live with Bilbo creating stuff? So typically, you would have some sort of CI process that takes stuff from Git, puts it into production whenever it's merged into main. If Bilbo's going to create stuff directly in production, then we're going to need narrow going the other way. Simple. But there is a problematic scenario around this. So going to have a timeline here. First thing happens is Bilbo creates a field. And then the CI system snapshots his field and gets ready to put those changes into source control. Bilbo creates another field. The first field reaches source control, and our CI system says, OK, well, now I'm going to commit the entire state of source control back to production, at which point Bilbo's second field is gone. Oh, dear. I mean, it sounds bad. But there's a feature called Delta CI, which GearSet has, and I've seen someone build out GitHub Actions, and something like that probably exists in other tools. So once you know the concept, you can look for this. So what happens here is everything is the same through that timeline, except that once the first field is in source control, we don't deploy the whole repository into production. We just deploy what's changed in the last commit. And so then field 2 is still there, and the next time you take a snapshot, that'll reach production. So if you're trying to build your own sort of system, which I wouldn't recommend, then build something that does this. If you're looking for a tool, make sure your tool does that and find out how it does it and use it if you want to do this way. I'm a dad, so, you know, dad joke, visual pun. Using that, we could do some sort of trunk-based development thing. If you're not familiar with that concept, the idea is the main branch, which is sometimes called trunk, is going along there. We've got our production Salesforce, and we want to create a feature. We create a branch in source control. We create a sandbox in Salesforce. The dev works in an IDE, creating their new stuff. And then when they're ready, they create a pull request, and our CI system can check that against production to make sure it's going to merge successfully and be deployable. Once all those checks have passed, we merge it into main, and off we go. So that is quite a simple way of doing things, and that is what people outside the Salesforce world would kind of advocate as a good way of doing continuous deployment, continuous delivery type development. And we can look at the pluses and minuses. Simple to get your head around, great. The features are quite small, which is good as well. You know, people could decide go, no go on those features. The CI tools are quite simple for that. But there are downsides that if you've got multiple developers working on the same feature, then they can only really collaborate by pushing stuff into production and then getting those updates back, which is tricky. There's no real data in those sandboxes you're working on, so it's difficult to do UAT with just the setup I had in that picture. And as I said before, some users don't actually want releases all the time. They want stability, build the big thing, train the people, and then they go on to use that feature. And so this might require feature flags, which companies that have used feature flags have dug themselves into massive holes sometimes. There are approaches to it, but if you just go into it without finding out the pitfalls, then you probably will dig your own hole. So another way of doing this is to have more long-lived feature branches. So I haven't drawn the source control bits of this because it starts to get really messy, and you can organize that in different ways. So just the orgs and how stuff flows between. So now we've got two different devs working in sandboxes in parallel on largely the same feature that we're trying to deliver, and then they're integrating that in another sandbox. Maybe someone else is building page layouts and things that bring everything together, and then it's going to production. And all of this might be living for weeks or months before the actual feature is produced. And as soon as you've got this, then you start to need the backpropagation sort of thing. So we need to keep updating our integration sandbox with what's happened in production while we're developing this. Otherwise, by the time we've finished, things will have drifted so much that we won't be able to deploy. And so when you see these DevOps tools talking about features like this backpropagation, I think it's quite important to understand why you actually need it and not to switch it on if you don't need it. So if you're adopting this sort of approach, this is the kind of place where we need it. This works quite nicely. We get some nice benefits that we can collaborate between the developers in that feature integration sandbox. They can pass stuff between each other, and they can rebase their source control to get those new features without having to go to production. And it's easy to add a UAT sandbox into that flow, get real users to actually properly test stuff. So we could do larger releases if that's what people want. And we can mitigate the fact that our release windows are quite far apart by making sure that we're bringing things back from production on a regular basis. But there are downsides. It requires more advanced tooling, more advanced procedures. If you look at some of the branching strategies that people use in their repos for this, it's crazy stuff they wouldn't touch. So again, I would go as simple as possible. And once you've started to merge stuff in that integration org, then often it can get stuck together and you can't selectively choose which parts of it you want to bring to production at that point. So those larger releases are more risky. They are more prone to failure. So there are all these downsides, but still, we have a go at DevOps. As I say, if you remember life before Salesforce DX, I mean, who remembers typing Apex literally into a browser window in a big text box? I mean, I do. Kier does. Okay, a couple of people. Things have come a heck of a long way since then. Occasionally I'd press Command and delete, and it would go back a page, and I'd lose all my code. It was awful. So things have moved on a lot, but it's really important with whatever we adopt in terms of DevOps. We have to understand our goals and why we're doing it and what we're aiming to get out of it, and ideally, how can we measure how well that's working. And we want to use the least amount of process possible. It may be that within a particular org, some features go through a more complex process and some go through a more simple one. And we don't want to fixate on a single metric. You can have all the metrics that make it look like DevOps, but it's still not DevOps. You can be deploying twice a day, but the only way to deploy is to send 10 messages on Teams in a zip file to somebody in the DevOps team who are basically just an ops team. That's still not really getting it right. So really, part of the reason why we're doing this is to try and build reliable software that can be delivered in a timely manner and actually be in the hands of users. And if your DevOps team are the only people who are allowed to deploy, they're not the DevOps team, they're the ops team. You've got developers and ops, and they're separate again. And it's really important to recognize if you're slipping into that sort of scenario. And to get the most out of this whole sort of DevOps approach, it's not just about deployment. It becomes something through the whole life cycle of the project. That really the way that you spec a project changes, because you're not going to say, well, I'm going to deliver it on this date in its entirety. You need to talk to them about iterating and developing stuff that way. You need to maybe adopt different coding practices. Like it can affect everything, but it's worth it because you get this kind of virtuous cycle that the cleaner code you write, the easier it is to make incremental deployments, which means that you can more easily refactor stuff because it's safer, which means that your code base stays cleaner, and it just gets better and better if you can get onto that train. And I would say that tools can't solve all of your problems, but they are much better than no tools. It's kind of tempting to just start out with, I could write some stuff in GitHub Actions, but my wife bought a horse for £1, and the total cost of ownership of that horse was very high. And if you start writing your own GitHub Actions, you're in the £1 horse scenario, and you should rethink your course of action and just go buy a tool instead, I would say. that is it. There are ways you can talk to me. You can talk to me afterwards. Thank you.
Are you taking questions?
If we've got time, I'm happy to. I may not answer them.
So what about DevOps Center and source tracking?
Yeah, I was 100% expecting that question. So the approaches that I showed, the trunk-based development, we use sandbox source tracking to be able to do that. DevOps Center, to be honest, I had a go at the beta. I haven't had a proper go at the production one, so I don't know how well that is going to serve in this. I'd love to talk to anyone who has had a proper go with it.
If anyone wants to give us a talk on DevOps Center,
Yeah.
I can do that. Extending it.
In regards to DevOps, especially for maybe like a new client or like one of those clients that you mentioned in the case, maybe 500 developers in the case, is something that when you're description, right? How do you prioritize what tools you need the most? So for example, obviously you can come and say, well, let's get the whole shebang, 18 months, £5 million, Mr. Stakeholder, please. But I'm sure that it's not everyday scenario. And then you probably need to compromise somewhere with your tools and the eloquency of your DevOps. Maybe that's the right way to say it.
Yeah, I think the bigger companies who have that much gravity behind them tend to have their own dev teams as well, and they will have some sort of thing in place there, and they may well have some idea about how much pain they're in from their current processes. But that really is a whole project that's separate to implementing any feature for them. So we try to just do the best we can in the area that we're in. And it is possible to move incrementally from one method of DevOps and deployment to another. I mean, when you have lots of dev teams, then that makes a very sort of natural way to make that sort of break of some people could be on one system and some people can be on another. And that's one of the advantages of treating production as the source of truth rather than source control, and being able to build a pipeline that can accept stuff that arrives in production and your DevOps system never knew about it. It means that one team can be in this new world while the rest are still doing it the old way, and you can sort of gradually move over rather than having to do some big bang that's bound to failure.
You're bang on there, so my next question was, because I thought you were saying incremental, and then my next question, well, if you progress incrementally, probably a point of no return. Too many tools, not onboarded tools, somebody's already used to a certain process. So how do you prioritize what's
Hard. That's definitely one of the hardest parts of all of this, is the people part of it and the internal politics and things. It's just hard. You can't really give generic advice on that. I think it depends on who you're talking to and where they are with understanding the value of this stuff.
I think with too many tools in DevOps, generally talking in terms of the developers in the team, and they generally do the development and then try to push the code to the UAT and then to SIT UAT and then go to production. So the process of DevOps, whenever it has come in, right, it tends to slow down the process to go to production. Right? That's what the ideal, the general thinking of a developer will be. So I have to push it to SIT UAT. In usual methods, they generally do it using change sets and then deploy the code immediately. Now they have to follow a process which tends to slow down the things to go to production because it has multiple checks in between. And though it is a good process, but when you think as a client, right, you are not getting at the time that what you want. For example, if the ideal process is like I have completed my development today, and I can push the code by day after tomorrow. But right now, because of the process that is involved, I can only push after a week or 10 days. Maybe the code quality is good, but sometimes what happens is the clients are ready to have that minimal defects that come in production, which can be fixed later on and do a deployment.
I think my answer to that is the part that I was saying about use the most simple thing you can. Like there are things that have to go into the hands of users before you can responsibly put them into production. And some of the things that are most like that is user interface changes, because it just has to be in front of the people who are going to use it. Because how many projects have you done where you build something and the people who are going to use it have never seen it, and eventually like, well, this doesn't work. You have to go through UAT for that. But then there are things where there are just simple data logic changes where if you can prove with unit tests that, yeah, this does what it says, you absolutely can and should have a simpler path for things like that, I think. And again, part of that comes to, if you can suck stuff back from production into your more complex pipelines, then you're able to have stuff that can shortcut things and be simpler if simpler is more appropriate. I think one of the things I didn't really talk about much is a big part of this is trust, I think. If you don't trust your developers, you put loads of process to make sure that they're doing things right. And I'd rather bring all the developers up to the point where I can trust them rather than just point loads of roadblocks in, because they will just figure ways around all those silly roadblocks. Don't expect me to have all the answers. I was here to say that it's terrible. Did you not see the bin fire? Yeah.
Given the complexities of deployment, what's your opinion or experience of kind of smoke testing in production? Obviously, the tests in stages where we're testing in sandboxes, but then how can we guarantee that if you're in production? So, would you recommend it? No.
I think at the end of the day, you have to test in production as well as all of this. Like, you can't just fire it over to production and then just say, well, everything was green in the pipeline, so it must be okay. And part of having a decent plan to deploy something is, how can I measure whether or not this has worked? What kind of, typically you could build a Salesforce dashboard or report that will give you indication quite quickly about whether things are working okay. But one of the things that is hard is that there are changes you can make in production which cannot be rolled back. There are changes that you make that, either because data starts to go off or just because it's how the platform works, you can't switch it back. So there's definitely an appropriate level of caution in letting stuff go forward. Well, thank you, everyone.
I think round of applause.